In the gaslit streets of Victorian London, where science and superstition walk hand in hand, some mysteries are better left unsolved. Tonight we continue the adventures of Detective Nathaniel Milbane and Victoria Pemberton as they descend into the dark depths beneath the city to confront a monstrous threat. This is Victorian Cthulhu, Episode 3, The Monster in the Sewers. The growler cab rattled through the November streets of London, its wheels grinding against wet cobblestones as the morning fog began to lift. Inside the four-wheeled carriage, Inspector Morrison sat opposite his 3 passengers, his expression as grey as the weather. "Rather exciting to meet a government minister," Wilchester remarked, adjusting his collar nervously. The mechanical engineer had donned his finest suit for the occasion, quite a change from his usual work attire. "You look very smart in proper dress, Mr. Chester," Victoria observed with a slight smile, "though I suspect you'd prefer your overalls." "I would, Miss Pemberton," Will admitted, as he adjusted his jacket with mild frustration. "They're far more practical for real work." Nathaniel Milbane's voice carried a note of cynicism. "I fail to see what excitement there is in being summoned like servants to dance attendance on some bureaucrat's whim." Morrison shifted uncomfortably. "I agree with you, Mr. Milbane. Truth is, I don't know why he wants to see you. I'm merely the messenger, and not entirely pleased about it either." The cab began its crossing of Westminster Bridge, and the Thames spread before them in all its murky grandeur. The great river wound through London like a dark artery, its waters reflecting the pale sky above. Barges and steamers moved slowly along its surface, while the occasional rowing boat darted between the larger vessels. A light morning mist had settled over the embankments, and the distinctive smell of river water and coal smoke drifted through the cab's windows. "It seems somehow much darker than the Hudson," Victoria pondered, as she thought back to how different London was to her New York home. The cab turned into Whitehall, and soon they found themselves before the imposing facade of the Home Office. Morrison led them through corridors that seemed designed to humble visitors, past portraits of stern officials who had served the Empire in decades past. Minister Clark's office was a study in understated authority. The man himself was lean and sharp-featured, with the bearing of someone accustomed to making decisions that affected thousands of lives. He gestured for them to sit while Morrison withdrew. "I shall speak plainly," Clark began, as an assistant served tea to the group. "Over the past week, 3 men have disappeared, all rat-catchers who were being employed by the city at the time." He opened a folder and withdrew several documents. The first 2 vanished while working in the storm drains beneath the East End. They were experienced men, familiar with the tunnels. The 3rd disappeared 2 nights ago while operating his ferry boat. The man disappeared, and the boat was left drifting on the river. "The rat-catcher ferry is rather famous among working folk," Nathaniel chipped in. "It would indeed cause a lot of local chatter if the ferryman disappeared." "It seems odd to me, Mr. Clark, that the government would seek the aid of a private firm for the disappearance of 3 rat-catchers," Victoria stated bluntly. "Do you not have a perfectly adequate police force?" Clark paused and shifted uncomfortably. "No bodies have been recovered." Clark's expression grew grave. "And more troubling still, word has begun to spread among the rat-catching community about something they are calling the Thames Monster. Superstitious nonsense, naturally, but if such rumours reach the general population..." "Trade would suffer," Nathaniel observed. "Catastrophically," Clark continued. "London's commerce depends upon confidence in the river. Ships must dock, goods must move, workers must cross daily. If people begin to fear the Thames itself..." Clark let the implication hang in the air. "So you require a discreet investigation," Nathaniel said. "Precisely. The police would reinforce the fear. Your recent successes in unusual cases suggest you might be better equipped to handle both the investigation and the discretion required." "So you aren't really concerned at all about the rat-catchers? This is just about trade?" said Will, a little flatly. "Of course we care, Mr. Chester," Clark said, oozing a little too much sincerity to be believed. Nevertheless, the investigators agreed to take the case, and Clark provided them with the names and last known locations of the missing men, along with details of their work schedules and the areas they frequented. The information was thorough, suggesting the government was taking the matter seriously. Outside the Home Office, the three investigators stood on the steps while London's afternoon traffic rumbled past. The morning mists had failed to clear, and a damp, smoky fog clung to the city. "We ought to speak with other rat-catchers," Will said. "Learn more about the missing men." "And examine the river where the ferryman disappeared," Victoria added. Nathaniel considered their options. The most efficient approach would be to divide our efforts, cover more ground in less time. "Agreed," said Victoria. "Will and I could take the river investigation." Will nodded. "I have access to a small and rather delightful boat that belongs to a colleague. As a matter of fact, I am rather keen to give it a try." "Excellent. I'll handle the rat-catchers," Nathaniel said, then paused. "Truth is, I'd prefer to avoid the river investigation myself." Will looked at him with curiosity. "Any particular reason?" Nathaniel was quiet for a moment, his jaw tightening almost imperceptibly. "I cannot swim. Never learned as a child." He met their eyes with a smile designed to mask anxiety. "Water unsettles me." The admission hung in the air between them for a moment before Victoria's response. "Then it's settled. You'll be far more effective with the rat-catchers anyway." Will's voice carried genuine warmth. "I think you are more likely to gain the trust of the rat-catchers alone. A crowd of us might spook them anyway." Nathaniel's posture straightened, his composure returning. "My thoughts exactly. There are public houses near the docks where such men gather after their work. That may prove more productive than questioning them in the tunnels." "We'll meet at the office this evening to share what we've learned," Victoria said. Nathaniel turned toward the East End docks, while Will and Victoria headed in the direction of the Thames as the sounds of London, muffled in fog, hung around them. The Anchor and Chains squatted beside the Thames like a weathered barnacle, its windows yellowed with decades of pipe smoke and its timbers dark with London's perpetual soot. Nathaniel pushed through the heavy oak door, immediately enveloped by the mingled scents of ale, tobacco, and the distinctive odour of men who worked in the city's dampest places. Conversation ceased as the patrons took note of his presence. A dozen faces turned toward him, most bearing the weathered features of those who laboured in darkness beneath London's streets. Nathaniel had shed his usual formal attire for a more modest coat, but his bearing still marked him as different from the establishment's usual clientele. The barman, a thick-set fellow with arms like hams, regarded him with suspicion. "Help you with something?" "I hope so," Nathaniel replied, approaching the bar. "I'm looking for information about the rat-catchers who've gone missing." The tension in the room became palpable. Several men shifted nervously, and one near the fireplace rose as if to leave. "You police?" the barman asked. "No, this is a private inquiry." Nathaniel placed a crown on the bar. "I'm trying to find out what happened to those men." The barman's eyes fixed on the silver coin, but he made no move to take it. "Private inquiry for who?" "People who want to see the missing men found safely." A voice from across the room spoke up. "If you ain't police, who's paying you to ask questions?" Nathaniel turned to locate the speaker and found himself facing two men seated at a corner table. The first was a wiry fellow with darting eyes and nervous energy, wearing a battered top hat that had clearly seen better days. His companion was larger and quieter, with a slow, gentle expression that suggested simplicity of mind. Both men wore an eclectic collection of clothing that appeared to have been salvaged from more prosperous owners, creating an almost theatrical effect. "If you gentlemen will let me buy you a drink, I will explain," Nathaniel replied. "May I join you?" The wiry man gestured to an empty chair. "Name's Cornelius Hobbs, sir, but everyone calls me Tweaks on account of me fiddling with me traps and such. This here's my partner, Edgar." Edgar nodded solemnly but said nothing. "Pleased to meet you both." Nathaniel settled into the chair and noted the small terrier sleeping beneath the table. "That's a handsome dog." "He's Mr. Rat," Tweaks said with a smile. "He's a Yorkshire. Most folk use Jack Russells, but Binns like to be different." The terrier opened one eye at the sound of his name, then resumed his nap. "Binns?" "Binns, or Alfie Wickham, one of the lads that's gone missing," Tweaks continued, his voice taking on a more serious tone. "Poor little fella's been waiting for his master to come home." Edgar spoke for the first time, his voice soft and sorrowful. "Binns was good to Mr. Rat. Fed him proper, he did." Nathaniel felt a pang of sympathy for both the animal and its devoted former owner. "You knew Alfie well?" "Known him for years," Tweaks replied. "Worked the same routes, shared information about the best hunting grounds. That's what makes this whole business so queer." "How so?" Tweaks leaned forward conspiratorially. Both Alfie and Tommy, what disappeared, were working the same section of storm drains. Same route, 3 nights apart. "The route they always worked?" "Aye, regular as clockwork. Been doing it for months. Never had trouble before." Tweak's expression grew troubled. "Then there's the matter of old Harry Buckles, the ferryman." "The man who disappeared on the river." Edgar nodded gravely. "Good man, Harry. Steady hand with the boat, knew the Thames like his own sitting room." "What made that night different?" Nathaniel asked. Tweaks glanced around the tavern, then lowered his voice. "Some of the lads say they've been hearing things down in the drains. Sounds that ain't natural. Scraping and sliding, like something big moving through the tunnels." "Rats make all manner of sounds," Nathaniel observed. "Not like this," Edgar said quietly. "This was something else, something bigger." Nathaniel absorbed this information carefully. "Would you be willing to show me this route your friends were working?" Tweaks and Edgar exchanged glances. "Might I could," Tweaks said slowly. "But it ain't cheap hiring a guide. What with Alfie gone, I got to look after Mr. Rat here, and that means buying food for him regular like." "How much food could such a small dog require?" "More than you'd think, and there's another problem." Tweaks paused dramatically. "I can't keep him long term, see? Got too many mouths to feed already." "You want our help finding your missing friends, you'd have to take responsibility for Mr. Rat yourself. Find him a good home." Nathaniel looked down at the sleeping terrier, then back at Tweaks. He placed some coins on the table and pushed them forward. "Here is 5 shillings for your time, but I am absolutely not taking the dog." Tweaks leaned forward and grinned as he placed his hands over the coin. Will guided his borrowed boat through the murky waters of the Thames with obvious pride in the craft's performance. The vessel was considerably smaller than the commercial steamers that plied the river, but its engine provided a steady, reliable power that impressed both Will and his passenger. "I owe you an apology, Mr. Chester," Victoria observed, noting how smoothly they moved against the current. "I thought your gasoline engine was just the dream of a mad scientist." "My colleague, Mr. Patterson, has made significant improvements to the design," Will replied, his eyes bright with enthusiasm. "The fuel mixture burns much more cleanly than in earlier models, and the power transmission is far more efficient." Victoria smiled at his obvious passion for the subject. "You speak of these engines as others might discuss horses. In many ways they're superior to horses. No feeding required when not in use, no temperamental behavior, and they can operate for hours without rest." Will gestured toward the new electric street lamps visible along the embankment. "Mark my words, we're witnessing the dawn of a new age. Electric lighting is already transforming some of the city at night." "I noticed the lamps on our way to the docks. They seem much brighter than gas lighting." "Indeed they are. More reliable too. Did you know they've just completed the first underground railway powered entirely by electricity? The City and South London line began operation only last month." Victoria found herself caught up in his excitement. "Underground trains powered by electricity? That seems almost magical." "Science often appears magical until we understand the principles behind it," Will said. "Though I must admit, travelling beneath the earth in a train does have an otherworldly quality." Their conversation was interrupted as Will reduced the engine's power. "We're approaching the area where the ferryman disappeared." Victoria looked around, noting the industrial character of this section of the Thames. Warehouses lined the banks, and the water itself seemed darker here, almost oily in its appearance. "It's quite different from the more fashionable areas of the river," she observed. "This is the working Thames," Will replied. "Commerce and industry rather than pleasure." He paused, studying the shoreline. Something familiar about this location. "How so?" Will pointed toward a cluster of buildings near the water's edge. "Unless I'm mistaken, we're quite close to the area where we confronted Silas Warwick during our last investigation." Victoria felt a chill that had nothing to do with the November air. "That seems an unusual coincidence." "Perhaps not so unusual," Will mused. "The docklands have always attracted those who prefer to conduct their business away from official scrutiny." They continued to examine the water's surface, searching for any clue that might explain the ferryman's disappearance. The Thames revealed nothing obvious, its dark waters flowing steadily toward the sea without hint of tragedy. "There," Victoria said suddenly, pointing toward the embankment. "That drainage outlet." Will followed her gaze and saw a large iron grating that marked where one of the city's storm drains emptied into the river. Storm drainage from the streets above. "Should we investigate?" Will guided the boat closer to the embankment, where they could see the grating more clearly. What they discovered made them both pause in surprise. "Those bars," Victoria said, "they've been bent outward." "Not just bent," Will observed, studying the twisted metal. "They appear to have been forced open from the inside." "Smugglers, perhaps?" Will shook his head slowly. "Smugglers would likely remove the grating entirely or break the lock. This appears to be the result of tremendous force applied to the bars themselves." He maneuvered the boat as close to the storm drain opening as possible. "I should take a closer look." "We have no lantern," Victoria pointed out, "and I'm hardly dressed for climbing about in drainage tunnels." "Just a quick examination," Will assured her. "I won't venture far inside." He secured the boat to a rusted iron ring set into the embankment, then carefully climbed from the boat to the narrow ledge beside the storm drain opening. The bent grating allowed him to squeeze through the gap, though not without some difficulty. Inside the tunnel, the darkness was nearly absolute. Will felt along the walls with his hands, trying to understand what had passed this way. His fingers encountered something that made him pause. "What is it?" Victoria called from the boat. "Some sort of substance coating the walls," Will replied, his voice echoing strangely in the confined space. "It feels almost like the trail a snail might leave, but much larger." He withdrew his handkerchief and carefully scraped a sample of the strange material, though he could barely see what he was collecting. "Will, please be careful," Victoria said. "We don't know what might have caused this damage." "You're quite right," he replied, beginning to back toward the opening. "Whatever did this possessed considerable strength." "You have cobwebs in your hair," she said as he emerged, reaching out instinctively to brush them away. "Thank you," Will said softly. For someone so warm and friendly, it seemed out of character that he looked away as she tidied him. "We should return to Bloomsbury," she said finally, breaking the pause. "Yes," Will agreed quickly, looking at the oily slime he collected. "Nathaniel will want to hear about this." Victoria and Will found Nathaniel waiting in their office, seated behind his desk, with an expression that suggested resignation mixed with bemusement. At his feet lay a small terrier, who looked up alertly as they entered. "I see you've acquired a companion," Victoria said, unable to suppress a smile. "This is Mr. Rat," Nathaniel said with the tone of a man explaining an unfortunate necessity. He belonged to one of the missing rat catchers. Will crouched down to examine the dog, who wagged his tail tentatively. "Yorkshire Terrier?" "Indeed." According to his previous owner's associates, Nathaniel's expression suggested he was still adjusting to the arrangement. "The rat catchers would only agree to help us in exchange for guaranteeing the animal's permanent care." "Well, he's quite charming," Victoria said, extending her hand for the dog to sniff. "Maybe you could do with a companion?" "So everyone keeps telling me," Nathaniel replied dryly. However, the information proved valuable, Both missing rat catchers were working the same route in the storm drain system. A man called Tweaks and his partner Edgar provided considerable detail about the disappearances. Victoria settled into her chair. Will and I also have some information. We found a storm drain outlet near where the ferryman disappeared. The iron grating had been forced open from the inside. From the inside? The bars were bent outward with tremendous force, Will confirmed, and I found traces of some sort of substance coating the tunnel walls. He produced his handkerchief, which contained the sample he had collected, rather like a snail's trail, but much larger. Nathaniel examined the sample carefully. Most unusual. The consistency appears almost organic. Rather like oil, added Will, but I've tested it, and it does not burn. Mr. Rat rose from his position by Nathaniel's feet and padded over to sniff at Will's handkerchief. The dog's reaction was immediate and unsettling. He backed away with a low whine, his tail dropping between his legs. The animal recognizes the scent, Nathaniel observed. Or fears it, Will added grimly. Also, the location was quite close to the workshops where we encountered Silas Warwick, Victoria added. Another curious coincidence. Perhaps, Nathaniel mused, we should pull on every little thread, I think, however unlikely. Will leaned against the desk. What's our next step? We have evidence of something unusual, but we need more information before we can act. I suggest we investigate these storm drains ourselves, Victoria said. The disappearances all occurred at night. Perhaps a daytime reconnaissance would be safer. Sound reasoning, Nathaniel agreed. However, we would need proper equipment for such an expedition. Lanterns, rope, basic tools. I can provide that, Will said eagerly, and perhaps some more practical clothing for all of us. The storm drains are not conducive to formal attire. More practical clothing? Victoria asked. Will smiled somewhat apologetically. Work clothes, overalls, that sort of thing. The tunnels can be quite rough on regular garments. That is, of course, if you don't mind such clothes, Miss Pemberton. If overalls are required for the investigation, then overalls I shall wear, Victoria said firmly. I am not so concerned with appearances that I would let them interfere with our work. Will looked both surprised and impressed. Very good then. Nathaniel watched this exchange with interest, while Mr. Rat returned to his side. Very well, we shall plan our expedition for tomorrow morning, during daylight hours. Mr. Chester will provide the necessary equipment. Should we bring the dog as well? Victoria asked. He may prove useful in tracking his former owner. Excellent suggestion, Nathaniel said, though his tone suggested continued uncertainty about the arrangement. He knows the storm drains better than any of us. Do any of us actually know anything about handling dogs? Will asked. Nathaniel and Victoria exchanged glances, then both shook their heads. Splendid, Nathaniel said. We shall be wandering unknown, probably dangerous tunnels, with amateur dog handling skills and equipment we have never used before. Splendid, indeed. Despite his pessimistic words, Mr. Rat's tail wagged enthusiastically, as if he understood that his services would be required in finding his missing master. The storm drains beneath London formed a vast network of tunnels that few surface dwellers ever considered. Built to channel rainwater from the streets above to the Thames below, they provided a dark, damp workspace for the men who kept them clear of debris and vermin. The very air seemed different down here, thick with moisture and the accumulated scents of a city's refuse, carrying whispers of decay that never quite reached the surface. Will had outdone himself with the equipment, providing each of them with sturdy work clothes and the latest in portable lighting. Victoria's overalls fit surprisingly well, transforming her appearance from fashionable young lady to practical investigator. The heavy canvas felt strange against her skin, so different from silk and taffeta, yet oddly liberating. You look very smart in your new outfit, Miss Pemberton, Will grinned, though I suspect you'd prefer your dresses. You are a wit indeed, Mr. Chester, Victoria laughed, but I will say they're wonderfully comfortable. I may have to consider incorporating such clothing into my regular wardrobe. Heaven forbid, Nathaniel muttered, though his tone carried more amusement than disapproval. Tweaks had proven as good as his word, arriving at the designated meeting point with intimate knowledge of the tunnel system. Edgar accompanied him, along with Mr. Rat, who seemed eager to begin the search for his missing master. "Right then," Tweaks said, lighting a lantern on the end of a pole. "This way leads to the section where Alfie and Tommy were working. Been down here hundreds of times, so don't you worry about getting lost." The descent into London's hidden arteries felt like entering another world entirely. The bullseye lanterns provided excellent illumination, casting steady beams that revealed the precise construction of the drainage tunnels, but they also created dancing shadows that seemed to move with lives of their own. The walls were brick and mortar, built to last centuries, with carefully calculated slopes to ensure proper water flow. Yet despite their solid construction, the tunnels felt oppressive, the weight of the city above pressing down hard upon them. Water dripped constantly from unseen sources, creating an irregular percussion that echoed strangely in the confined space. The sound of their footsteps seemed muffled and distant, as if the very air conspired to swallow sound. Victoria found herself unconsciously moving closer to Will, the civilized world of gas-lit streets and familiar parlours feeling impossibly distant. "Remarkable engineering," Will observed, as they navigated a particularly well-constructed junction, his voice carrying a forced cheerfulness that didn't quite mask his own unease. The Romans would have appreciated this level of sophistication. Romans didn't have to deal with London's rainfall, Tweaks replied pragmatically, "though I'll grant you, these tunnels are built proper. Still give me the shivers, mind. Place like this, you start hearing things that ain't there." They had been walking for perhaps 20 minutes when Mr. Rat's behaviour began to change. The little terrier, who had been trotting confidently ahead of the group, suddenly became more cautious. His ears pricked forward, and he began sniffing the air with obvious concern. "Something's got his attention," Edgar observed quietly. Nathaniel noted the dog's altered demeanour. Animals often sense things before we do. The tunnel ahead opened into a wider chamber where several passages converged. Their lantern light revealed evidence of the rat-catcher's previous work, neat piles of debris that had been cleared from the smaller passages, and the remains of small fires where the men had warmed themselves during long shifts. "This is where they spent most of their time," Tweaks explained. "Good hunting here, lots of rats coming down from the markets above." Victoria raised her lantern to examine the various tunnel mouths. "That opening there, it looks different from the others." The beam of her light fell upon something that made them all pause. Unlike the precisely constructed drainage tunnels, this opening appeared rough and unfinished, as if it had been carved rather than built. The edges were jagged and irregular, and a foul odour emanated from within, something organic and putrid that made Victoria cover her nose with her sleeve. "That weren't there before," Tweaks said with certainty, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. "Been working these tunnels for 3 years, and that's new." Edgar nodded agreement, his round face pale in the lantern light. "Something dug that out recent-like, something big." The walls around the strange opening were coated with the same substance Will had found at the Thames outlet, but here it was much thicker, almost rope-like in places. The material gleamed wetly in their lantern light, and where it had dried, it had formed grotesque patterns that reminded Victoria of some diseased spider's web. The smell grew stronger as they approached, a nauseating mixture of decay and something else. Something alien that had no place in the natural world. "The slime trail," Will announced, pulling out his handkerchief to cover his nose, "much more extensive than what we found by the river, and it's fresh." Mr. Rat approached the opening and immediately began to whine, backing away with his tail between his legs. The little terrier's distress was palpable, his body trembling as primitive instincts warned him of danger beyond human comprehension. But then something else happened, something that made them all freeze. From deep within the rough-hewn tunnel came a sound none of them had heard before. It was a wet, sliding noise, as if something large and formless was moving through the confined space. The sound seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, echoing strangely off the tunnel walls, until it was impossible to judge distance or direction. It grew louder, accompanied by what could only be described as breathing, though unlike any natural rhythm, a horrible, rasping wheeze that spoke of corrupted lungs and alien anatomy. The temperature seemed to drop around them, and Victoria found herself shivering despite her heavy clothing. The lantern flames flickered as if disturbed by some unfelt wind, casting wild shadows that danced and writhed on the tunnel walls. "What in God's name?" Tweaks whispered, his voice cracking with terror. The sound stopped abruptly, replaced by a silence that seemed to press against their eardrums with physical weight. In that terrible quiet, they could hear their own hearts beating, their own rapid breathing. Then came something worse, a series of wet, scraping noises that suggested movement toward their position, the sound of something massive dragging itself through the tunnel with horrible purpose. "We should leave," Nathaniel said quietly. "Now." But even as he spoke, something began to emerge from the dark tunnel. At first, it was merely a suggestion of movement in the shadows beyond their lantern light. Then it became visible, and the sight of it struck terror into all of them. The creature appeared to have no fixed form. Its dark bulk flowed like liquid while simultaneously maintaining enough solidity to move with horrible purpose. Tentacle-like appendages writhed from its central mass, and what might have been eyes gleamed wetly in the lantern light. "Dear God," Victoria breathed. The formless shape paused at the edge of their light, as if considering its options. Then, with shocking speed, it surged forward. Tweaks, who had been closest to the opening, barely had time to cry out before dark appendages wrapped around him. The creature's grip was implacable, and despite his struggles, Tweaks was dragged toward the tunnel mouth. Will started forward, but Nathaniel grabbed his arm. "Don't. It's too late." The last they saw of Tweaks was his terrified face as he disappeared into the darkness of the creature's lair. His cries echoed from the tunnel for a moment, then faded into silence. Edgar stood frozen, his mind struggling to process what he had witnessed. Mr. Rat was barking frantically, his small body quivering with distress. "We have to help him," Victoria said, though her voice shook. "With what?" Nathaniel demanded. "We have no weapons, no knowledge of what we're facing. Going after him now would only result in more victims." The terrible logic of his words settled over them. They were 3 investigators and a simple man, armed with nothing but lanterns, facing a creature that defied rational explanation. "We retreat," Nathaniel said grimly. "We learn what we're dealing with, and we come back prepared." As they made their way back through the tunnel system, the sound of Tweak's final screams echoed in their minds. Behind them, the creature's lair remained ominously silent. 2 days later, they sat in Professor Blackwood's study at University College, the weight of their failure pressing heavily upon them. The scholar himself appeared more robust than when they had last seen him, though the events of the Hampstead investigation had left him with a haunted quality around the eyes that seemed to recognize their current distress. "The sample you've brought is most intriguing," Blackwood said, examining Will's handkerchief through a magnifying glass. "Combined with your description of the creature, it presents a disturbing picture." "And did you find anything in your research?" Victoria asked. "I have spent every waking hour investigating similar phenomena since you brought me your initial findings," Blackwood replied. "Such mysteries often have historical precedents, though they may be obscured by the passage of time or dismissed as folklore." He took a small book from the drawer of his desk. "This came to my attention through colleagues who specialize in exploration accounts. It's a personal diary of Captain Marcus Thornfield, who led an Arctic expedition in 1847. "What relevance does an Arctic expedition have to our situation?" Nathaniel asked. Blackwood opened the journal carefully, its pages yellowed with age. "Captain Thornfield describes an encounter with what he terms a formless spawn. The account bears remarkable similarity to what you've described." He began to read from the journal. The creature emerged from the ice caves like some nightmare-given substance. Its form seemed to shift and flow, as if it possessed no fixed shape. Dark, writhing appendages grasped 3 of my men before we could react. "What happened to the captured men?" Will asked urgently. "Well," continued Blackwood, turning several pages, "one man escaped after being held captive for nearly a week. According to his account, the creature consumed one man immediately upon reaching its lair. Victoria felt sick. And the others? It kept them alive, providing them only water from its appendages. The survivor reported that the second man was consumed 3 days after capture. He realized he would be next, unless he could escape." "How did he manage it?" Nathaniel asked. "The creature left him alone during the night. The man managed to break free and escape while it was absent." Blackwood closed the journal. This could be rather good news. "Based on this account, your friend Tweaks may still be alive." Hope flared in Victoria's chest. "Then we must act quickly." "Indeed, time is critical." Blackwood returned the journal to its shelf. "However, we must also consider how such a creature might be defeated. Captain Thornfield's account provides some guidance." "The expedition had weapons, surely," Will said. "They did, but conventional weapons proved ineffective against the creature's form. However, Thornfield noted that the beast seemed particularly vulnerable to salt. When they spread salt around their camp perimeter, it appeared reluctant to approach." "Salt?" Nathaniel asked. "Thornfield theorized that creatures with such fluid physiology might be susceptible to osmotic pressure," Blackwood explained. "Salt draws moisture from living tissue through natural processes. A creature dependent on maintaining fluid balance might find concentrated salt highly damaging." Will's expression brightened. "Salt is readily available at the docks. With winter approaching, they maintain large supplies for treating the roads. We could acquire sufficient quantities to create barriers or weapons," Victoria added. "The principle is sound," Blackwood said, "though I must emphasize that we're dealing with speculation based on a single historical account." Nathaniel stood and began pacing, his fingers steepled in concentration. "If we accept the possibility that Tweaks is still alive, we face both opportunity and extreme danger. A rescue attempt would require careful planning and adequate manpower." "Manpower?" Will asked. 3 investigators against a creature of unknown size and capabilities would hardly constitute favorable odds. We would need assistance." Victoria nodded slowly. "The rat catchers, Tweaks was one of their own. They would understand both the urgency and the dangers involved." "Precisely. Men familiar with the storm drain system who have personal investment in rescuing their colleague." Will was already considering the logistics. We would need to transport significant quantities of salt through the storm drains, wheelbarrows or small carts, perhaps. "And a method to lure the creature from its lair," Victoria added. "Something to draw it into a position where the salt could be effective." "Bait," Nathaniel said grimly. "Fresh meat to attract its attention." The implications of this plan settled over them soberly. They were contemplating a direct confrontation with a creature that had already claimed multiple victims, using theoretical weapons based on a 40-year-old exploration account. "Tomorrow," Nathaniel decided, "we gather our materials and allies tonight. Tomorrow we return to the storm drains." As they left Blackwood's office with new purpose, Victoria turned to the scholar, sat at his desk. "Thank you for your assistance, Professor. You have been an invaluable aid." "You have indeed," added Nathaniel. "Oh, there is one more thing before we go." "Of course, I am at your disposal," Blackwood replied. "I don't suppose you want a dog?" The rat catchers, via a request from Edgar, arrived with a solidarity that spoke to the bonds forged by dangerous work and shared hardship. 6 men now laboured in the storm drain junction, unloading sacks of salt they had acquired from the dock warehouses. "This is a strange state of affairs," one of them muttered as he positioned another sack near the creature's tunnel. Monsters in sewers, that's more than strange, another replied grimly. Nathaniel supervised the construction of their trap with military precision. The salt barriers formed a circle approximately 10 feet from the creature's tunnel mouth, creating a containment area that should prevent the beast from escaping once it emerged. Remember, he told the assembled men, the moment the creature enters the circle, we must close it, then aim for the central mass if you can identify it. Victoria checked her sack of salt, then looked at the pig carcass Will had positioned in the centre of their trap. You're certain this will lure it out? No, Miss Pemberton, I'm not certain of any of this at all, Will replied, scratching his head. Edgar stood near the tunnel mouth, his features set with determination. Tweaks is down there. We've got to get him back. Everyone ready? Nathaniel asked. The rat catchers took their positions around the perimeter, each armed with additional sacks of salt. Will had also brought several shovels, which could be used to spread salt more effectively if their initial assault failed. Pull the rope, Nathaniel ordered. One of the rat catchers began dragging the pig carcass across the tunnel mouth, creating noise and movement designed to attract the creature's attention. For several long minutes, nothing happened. Then Mr. Rat began to growl low in his throat, his hackles rising. The wet, sliding sound they remembered from their previous encounter began to emerge from the dark tunnel. It grew louder, accompanied by that unnatural breathing rhythm that suggested something vast and alien moving through the confined space. "Here it comes," Edgar whispered. What emerged defied every rational expectation. The creature's formless bulk flowed like black water, yet maintained enough coherence to propel itself forward with terrifying speed. Tentacle-like appendages writhed from its central mass, smothering the carcass and enveloping its prey. Now clear of the tunnel, several of the rat catchers stepped forward, dumping salt sacks to block off its retreat. The creature paused at the edge of their salt barricade, as if sensing danger. "Hold steady," Nathaniel commanded, though his own voice carried strain. Now encircled, the formless spawn tested the salt barriers cautiously, extending one appendage toward the white crystals. When it made contact, there was a sharp hissing sound, and the creature recoiled as if burned. "It works," Will said with relief. Their celebration was premature. The creature, apparently enraged by the salt's effect, launched itself forward with shocking speed. It struck the barrier and recoiled, but its momentum carried it partially into the circle before it could retreat. "Now!" Nathaniel shouted. The rat catchers immediately began hurling salt at the trapped creature. Where the crystals made contact, the creature's form seemed to shrivel, producing horrible sounds that echoed through the tunnels. Steam rose from its body as the salt burned through its fluid tissue. The formless spawn writhed and twisted, its shape shifting frantically as it tried to escape the salt that was destroying its coherence. Gradually, its movements became less coordinated, and it began to lose the unity that had allowed it to maintain its threatening size. "It's weakening," Victoria observed. Will seized this opportunity to approach the creature's tunnel. "I'm going after Tweaks." "Will, be careful," Victoria called after him. The creature was contained but not dead, and their salt supply was limited. Will's lantern light disappeared into the dark tunnel, leaving them to maintain their assault on the writhing creature. Several agonizing minutes passed before his voice echoed from the depths. "I've found them, they're alive." When Will emerged from the tunnel, he was supporting a weak but conscious Tweaks. Behind him came another figure, barely able to walk, but definitely breathing. "Tweaks!" Edgar exclaimed, tears streaming down his face. The rescued rat catcher was emaciated and clearly traumatized by his ordeal, but his eyes showed recognition when he saw his friends and colleagues gathered around him. "And that's Harry Buckles," one of the rat catchers identified the second rescued man. "The ferryman, what disappeared?" Both men were in dire need of medical attention, but they were undeniably alive. The creature, meanwhile, had lost so much of its coherence that it no longer posed an immediate threat. its remaining mass huddled against the far wall of the circle, hissing weakly as the salt continued its destructive work. "We should leave while we can," Nathaniel said. "The creature may recover if given time." As they helped the rescued men toward the tunnel entrance, Victoria looked back at the dissolving horror they were leaving behind. "What about that thing?" "Not our concern for now," Nathaniel replied grimly. "We've done what we came to do." It was 3 weeks later when Nathaniel opened his door to Inspector Morrison. "Good afternoon," he said, removing his hat with obvious irritation. "I trust you won't mind another visit from Her Majesty's delivery service." "You seem less than pleased with your assignment," Victoria observed. "3 times in a fortnight I've been sent to play courier." Morrison settled into a chair with a heavy sigh. "The Minister appears to have designated me as his personal communications department." Nathaniel looked up from the papers scattered across his desk. "I assume you bring news of our recent adventure?" Among other things, Morrison withdrew a folded document from his coat. "Minister Clark wishes me to convey his satisfaction with the resolution of the Thames matter. The official account will cite structural damage to the storm drain system, which covers the necessary repairs without alarming the public." "And the creature?" Will asked. "Disposed of by government specialists. Apparently there are individuals within certain departments who handle such matters regularly." Morrison's tone suggested he found this revelation unsettling. "The Minister also asked me to report on the welfare of the rescued men." "How are they faring?" Victoria inquired. "Tweaks has returned to his work, though his colleagues say he's developed a nervous disposition about enclosed spaces. Can't say I blame him. Harry Buckles is back to his ferry service, but only during daylight hours now." Morrison paused, glancing around the office. "Speaking of our rat-catcher friends, what became of their dog?" As if summoned by the question, Mr. Rat emerged from beneath Nathaniel's desk, where he had been maintaining his customary vigil. The small dog regarded Morrison with the serious expression of a creature who took his responsibilities seriously. "He's claimed residence here," Nathaniel said, his tone carefully neutral. "Animals form attachments." Morrison smiled. "And their owners do as well, I'd wager." "I merely provide meals and shelter," Nathaniel replied, though his hand moved unconsciously to stroke the dog's head. "The rat-catchers have been spreading word about your assistance," Morrison continued. "It would surprise you how well connected they are. You may find yourselves with more clients than you can handle." "Are such unusual problems common?" Will asked. Morrison's expression grew thoughtful. "More than you might expect, and far more common than the government prefers to acknowledge." Victoria leaned forward. "What does that mean exactly?" "It means, Miss Pemberton, that London is a very old city with very old secrets." After Morrison departed, the 3 partners found themselves in contemplative silence. Outside their window, the afternoon bustle of Bloomsbury continued, ordinary people going about their ordinary business. "Well," Victoria said finally, "we seem to have established a reputation." "An unusual reputation," Will added. Nathaniel absently scratched Mr. Rat behind the ears, earning a contented sigh from the terrier. Perhaps that's precisely the sort of reputation worth having. The small dog settled more comfortably against Nathaniel's feet, his presence a reminder of their recent underground adventure and the bonds that had been forged in those dark tunnels. Outside, the November afternoon was giving way to evening, and the gas lamps were beginning to flicker to life along the London streets. Victoria wondered to herself, as the group discussed the letters they had received, what secrets London still had to show her. And so ends this tale of Victorian London, where supernatural forces lurk beneath the veneer of civilized society. Who knows what perils still await for our heroes to uncover in the shadowed depths below. If you enjoyed this underground tale, please give it a like. Likes, subscribes and comments will really help the channel, and it allows other lovers of dark horror to find us in the fog. Until then, sleep well and be mindful of what stirs beneath your feet.